In 2005, Half-Life 2 Lost Coast was released, which was a tech demo showcasing HDR for the Source engine. But alongside that, the game also introduced developer commentaries, a novel piece of additional content which showcased the developers' stories, thoughts, and lessons they learned across development of the game.
Hi, this is Gabe Newell, and welcome to The Lost Coast.
Since the developer commentary for this game, Valve has since made developer commentaries for almost every game they've released. And there's even been developers that were inspired by this and put developer commentaries in their own games. I won't be focusing on those for today, but I was just curious. What if I compiled all the advice that Valve gave in these developer commentaries, and I made a game out of this advice? How good would the game be? Would it feel like a Valve game? Now I'm going to put this as a disclaimer. You're gonna hear game inspired by Valve, and you're gonna think, oh my god, this is gonna be some big, polished, ambitious project. But no, I just want to keep it small for now. Maybe I will expand on it later, but it's just a demo of where I think this idea could lead. Now with that over, let's talk about what kind of game I wanted to make. For my first idea, I thought, you know what? Valve has some pretty fun horror sections in their games, like Ravenholm in Half-Life 2, or the Jeff chapter in Half-Life Alyx. It's kinda strange how these sections are well liked by fans and very memorable, but Valve has never made a full horror game. So I decided to roll with that idea. When I was in middle school, I really liked the Half-Life 1 horror mod, Cry of Fear, and it inspired me to come up with an idea for a game similar to it that I wanted to make in the future. I came up with a couple of enemy designs, and I thought, you know what? Might as well borrow them for this game. Although they're a bit edgy for my taste now. There were also a bunch of other miscellaneous mechanics that I borrowed from other horror games. With the brainstorming of the game idea done, I immediately started working on the game right after my previous video 2 months ago. And I was gonna make it in Godot because I love free open source software. I started off by salvaging assets that I made for previous scrapped games, or by salvaging assets that were made by other people who helped me work on those games. Like this one third-person horror game that took place on a spaceship, or this janitor game. I thought that it would save me time considering my upload schedule. When I was taking notes on what advice Valve was giving out, the immediate pieces of advice that stuck out to me were at first from Left 4 Dead, because it directly related to horror.
One film technique we brought to Left 4 Dead was the idea of grain. Film grain is most apparent in dark scenes, which made it an attractive visual effect for our game. Grain does a good job of implying detail in darkness, adding grittiness and texture. However, we found in playtesting that if we applied grain uniformly, people would quickly tire of the effect. We hit upon a method for dynamically varying the grain effect based on light level. Scenes range from grainy texture in darkness and shadows to no grain at all in the brightest spots.
I thought that the implied texture in darkness would add to the horror because the developers of Amnesia: The Dark Descent mentioned how players would scare themselves by thinking there's something in the level that's making sound when there really wasn't, and it was only part of the ambience. My thinking was that the detail from implied film grain would achieve the same effect.
They were walking through these environments, we didn't give them any systems to interact with, and they started making up things on their own. Slightest sound, a monster is near. Was that a shadow there? Perhaps someone is stalking me, and so on and so forth.
They also mentioned how adding fog to Left 4 Dead 1 ironically made visibility better because you could see enemies contrast against the fog if the fog is a gray color.
Smoking the set is a common film technique used to help separate background and foreground elements. We use particles and distance-based fog to do our own version of smoking. Our first experiments proved frustrating for players. We used a realistic dark fog, but this obscured character silhouettes and gave no sense of the vast surrounding environment. Once we lightened up the fog, The maps gained a greater sense of scale and distance, and the readability of characters greatly improved, so the players could more easily tell friend from foe.
As I discovered later on, it definitely did add to the horror, because many playtesters that I had pointed out that the atmosphere was one of the highlights of the game.
The sound effects are crazy, honestly. It's so atmospheric.
I also took into consideration the fog while I was designing levels. I would then shift my focus towards Valve's core design philosophies, which in hindsight I should have done first, but it's whatever. The major takeaways from the Valve developer commentaries was that Valve heavily focuses on playtesting, and they also focus heavily on teaching the player mechanics so that they can understand them. They describe how Valve playtests in stages, where the first stage, they start with a rough early build of a game that is playtested among developers at the company so that they can describe their issues more technically, and they're more willing to put up with problems of a build. Specifically, first, in these groups of developers that Valve developers like to form into called cabals, where the project first starts at, and then they can move on playtesting to developers outside of the cabal. Then, after their game gets a little bit more polished, they then move the playtests to the friends and families of the developers. And then after more polish, they then move it on to other playtesters that are outside those circles. In this outer circle of playtesters, which is QA, experienced gamers will be able to explain their problems more easily with a game, like developers. But also, gamers with a wide variety of skill will be able to use tools creatively during combat. But also, if you let people playtest your game who have never played a video game before, you can learn some valuable things. Although Valve never specified what kinds of things you can learn from those types of playtesters, my guess is that if you let playtesters play your game who have never touched a video game in their life, you can check if your game is intuitive or not, just through real-life experience and not just video game intuition. To go into more depth about how these playtests are conducted, basically you are not allowed to help or hint at the solutions to any puzzles in a game. You just stay silent to simulate a scenario of someone buying a game and playing it in their bedroom. Playtesters are encouraged to think out loud so that developers may find it easier to take notes to solve certain issues. Maybe they misunderstand a mechanic, for example. Playtesters would also have webcams to see their reactions. Although for me, since my playtesters were online acquaintances, some were uncomfortable with showing their face. They also describe this aspect of playtesting where, for a mechanic, over the course of learning that mechanic, you design the climax first, or the endpoint of learning that mechanic, so that you can decide whether the idea is fun or not, and then you can work your way backwards to teach the player how to learn that mechanic through iteration and playtesting. It would save you time and effort if you would have otherwise added a mechanic that wasn't fun, and it also gives you insight into what types of lessons and skills that the player needs to learn when learning a mechanic. In a similar way, manhacks from Half-Life 2 were first designed in a test map to experiment with their behavior before making an actual level to introduce them to the player. This then bleeds into how Valve teaches players mechanics. When players first learn a mechanic, they're often put in a scenario where they can see how the mechanic works, but they can't be harmed, just so that the player can understand how the mechanic works. But then after that, they can introduce more varied uses of that mechanic, which are more challenging. The same thing can apply for the introduction of enemies. So how does this apply to my game? Well, I wanted to introduce the very first enemy in the game behind a transparent wall so that you can see what it does without actually being harmed. Kind of like the Zombine in Half-Life 2 Episode 1. Also, I try to teach the player that you can pick up items and that you can open doors by running into them, by placing them next to each other in the same place and causing them to be in the way of where the player needs to proceed. It also helps that the very first item was a flashlight, and players tend to be attracted towards light sources. I adjusted the encounter of the enemy based on feedback from playtesters because some of them did not see the enemy for the first time. So I decided to change the placement of this one barrel that was on fire to be closer to the fence where you can see the enemy, so that the curiosity of the player was enticed by the fire barrel, and then they would see the enemy. Which then seemed to have worked because I saw a lot more people seeing the enemy. Besides those big pieces of advice, I also followed some other miscellaneous advice. I used placeholder assets just to save time and to test if an idea works. I decided to add adaptive items like Half-Life 2 supply crates, which give you what you need based on how much ammo and health you are at. In Valve's level design, they tend to have parts of a level that share glimpses into future parts of a level that you explore later. They wanted to encourage exploration, so they often would place loot in small areas that you could explore. That was basically it for the Valve developer advice. Although I did look at other sources to kind of make my game better as a horror experience. If you want to try out my game, or at least what I have of it so far, you can go to the description and go to the itch.io link that I have provided. All the notes I took for the video are also down there, which contains Valve's developer advice that I thought was pretty important, but also my own pieces of advice that I've learned while making the game. Overall, I feel like Valve's advice genuinely does help. I feel like if I didn't have any of the aspects that I've mentioned, my game would be far worse. And I've made a horror game before, which had a lot of problems. So, I think, because of extensive playtesting, I think that made my game better. The way that it seems to me is that Valve went about a pragmatic approach when giving out advice, where they were based on experience of what seemed to work with them. It's as if they're treating video games as an engineering problem where they iterate and design better ways to make the player have fun. And I kind of find that interesting. But anyway, if you've enjoyed the video, like, share, and subscribe to support the channel and the algorithm. If you want to support me more directly, my Patreon is in the description where you can get early access to new videos. See ya.